Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our first edition of The Power of Beef. We're going to take a look at what sold, how much sold, and certainly some of the pressures and the opportunities that are out there as well. Now, the numbers that you're going to see today are based on the US market. The Power of Beef, that this one is derived from, looks exclusively at the US market. So the numbers, I think, are going to be a little bit different for Canada, but I think the trends are going to be very much the same. And you're also going to see a lot of different pictures from all around the world. So I hope you will enjoy this information. So of course, we all know that 2020 was an unbelievable year for all of grocery retailing, but in particular for the meat department. Meat actually increased its share. And as a percent of the total, we were up 19.2% in dollars, a little bit less in pounds because, of course, due to the supply chain issues, we saw quite a bit of inflation. But beef by far was the number one performer, up 24% in dollars in the United States and 13% in pounds. That, in fact, was nothing new. Beef also was the best performer the year before, and fresh meat altogether did a little bit better than processed, which would be items like hot dogs, smoked ham, that type of thing, even though both areas of the store did extremely well. So when we look a little bit further at beef, it's very interesting to see that in terms of the dollar share of a percentage of total meat, beef actually increased year over year. And we're now at almost 55% of all dollars spent on meat being spent on beef. So that's why beef is so important to retailers in the US and Canada alike. In terms of share of pounds, that's when you see chicken come on very, very strong. But still, beef and chicken by far are the biggest ones in terms of percentage of pounds. And we also increased there to about 37% of all fresh meat pounds sold in the retail environment. When we look at the individual parts of beef, the different cuts, you see that there are some that are circled in red. The reason for that is because it's interesting to see which cuts increased faster than that overall rate of 23.8%. And that's where you see ribeye come on very strong, sirloin, ribs, etc. And what this indicates is that people we're very much in the mood to try something different. We typically see a lot of ribs being sold through the restaurant channel. What we saw this year is that ground did extremely well, so we'll see here in a second, but all these different items did well too because people were looking to celebrate at home. And oftentimes the classic holiday cuts like the big turkey or the big ham didn't fit the party size. And that's really where ribeyes and other high-end beef cuts jumped in and did extremely well in the current market. Here you see ground, and even though I would say ground beef is by far the powerhouse in this area, more than 11, almost $12 billion sold in ground beef, up 21%. It's very important to point out that all the other proteins are figuring out that ground is really a way to get a foot in the door. So you see lamb and bison and all sorts of different areas, venison, pork, all trying to push ground items into the meat case. And that is something to keep in mind. But I would say altogether, ground beef continues to be a big powerhouse because it's so versatile, because it's kid friendly, all the right reasons, in addition to the price per pound being very attractive to consumers as well. Now, if we think about last year, we had spikes in March of 2020 that were 90% over normal. There is no way we can match those spikes, and that's pretty much true for everything in the store. But what we are seeing is that we are able to hold the line against the normal demand, shall we call it, of 2019. And so when we're lapping against those March spikes, you see an incredible dip down in the sales in both volume and dollars. That's what the blue and the lighter blue line are about. But if you look at the green and the orange, that's the demand against 2019. And as you can see, in both March and April, we sit very comfortably above that normal demand still. If we look a little bit more specifically at April 2021 versus a year ago, as well as versus 2019, that's the areas highlighted in blue, you see that we still do very nicely in terms of the demand against 2019 pre-pandemic normal. Beef circled there in red in the top, up 21% still versus 2019, even though that reflects a 15% reduction against last year. But again, that was one of the strongest months we have ever seen in the history of food retailing. So demand continues to be very strong. Here in the US, the restaurants are almost back to normal sales levels. I think Canada, you're going to see that in the next couple of months, probably by the end of the year as well. So it's great to see that despite strong restaurant demand, we continue to see really good retail demand as well. Now, for beef, the beauty of that is that we didn't really lose a whole lot of beef customers throughout the last year, despite all the inflation that we've been seeing. And in fact, what we're seeing is people are taking a few more trips a year, which is the number of times they buy beef throughout a 52-week period. But more than anything, they're spending significantly more when they are buying beef, and that resulted in an overall spend per buyer of 10%. So it's very important for us to hold on to that bigger basket because that really benefits everybody throughout the beef supply chain. And if you compare that to the total meat department, you see that we also still have a little bit of room to grow. In total, 97% of people buy meat and 91% buy beef. So that's an opportunity for us. Can we still get that extra 6% in household penetration? We have quite a number of trips, 22.7 throughout the year, but in reality, 42 times a year people buy meat. So how can we convert better on the beef front? And in terms of the spend per trip, we're very much in line. So we still have some opportunities for beef relative to the total meat trip. And these new trip patterns, I would say, have many implications as well. We still see people in store a little bit less often than we did before, and they tend to buy more items when they are in the store. So for the retailers and packer processors on the phone with us today, think about how important shelf life is, and both in store because people are not shopping as often, and at home for people who want to freeze items or just have them in the refrigerator and last a little bit longer. It also has implications to minimize out of stock when people are in store. You want to make sure they spend as much as they were planning to, if not a little bit more, and also optimizing package assortment is a big part of that. What we're seeing here in the US is a lot more focus on that new and improved packaging material that is out there. So several retailers are actually educating consumers about the vacuum packs or the skin packs and the fact that they are freezer ready, the fact that it allows them for longer shelf life, and really educating that it's not just a leak-proof type of solution, but something that really fits into their new lifestyle and new shopping patterns as well. We have not seen trips come back at all, so this is a great example to steal from for the Canadian market as well. So let's talk a little bit about meat's role and reputation, because there's been a lot written about meat and beef in particular. So for the last 16 years, the Power of Meat has been asking about meat eating versus flexitarians, which are people who eat meat, but not every day, maybe 2-3 days a week. Vegan vegetarians, they don't eat meat at all, or pescatarians, people that only eat fish. And as you can see, is just since 2019, we've seen quite a significant drop in those who say, I am a meat eater. And instead, it's not really vegan vegetarians that are growing. In fact, it's been about the same percentage for 13, 16 years, but it's really the flexitarians that are growing. And if you think about it, in a way, they are our swing voters. They want to eat meat. You're just not quite sure if it's good for them, if it's good for the planet. They have a lot of guilt over eating meat. And I wanted to show some consumer videos with you that are very telling in this regard.
3 meals a day, if you're having beef every meal, it's really harmful for your body. And there's been a lot of research that shows that eating plant-based diets is overall better for your health and helps you perform better and gives you more energy. So I haven't had the heart to cut out chicken yet, but I've managed to do beef and pork okay. And it's made a noticeable difference to my health, I think. I think there's definitely room for it. You know, if you have maybe a steak every once in a while, but I don't think it's good for people to eat, like I said, 3 meals a day every day. Eating, you know, just meats and stuff. I think there's plenty of other substitutions that could be the proteins that you need.
I do absolutely think that there's room for meat in a healthy diet. For me and for my family, there's almost always a lean protein on the plate for dinner. I have thought about trying to introduce at least one day a week vegetarian, because I do think that cutting back on the amount of meat that we eat as Americans and as global citizens is probably healthy for a number of reasons. But absolutely, I do think that that meat in moderation can be and is healthy.
Yes, I actually do. I think with all things comes balance. And do I think you should be eating steak and potatoes and canned corn for every meal? No, but I think that meat belongs in it. I'll go an entire day without having some kind of meat. Once in a while, we'll do a meatless day or a meatless dinner, and it's no big deal to my family. But we tend to eat balanced amount, I think, close to what the dietary guidelines say for our meat consumption. I'm not actively looking to cut back on meat.
I think meat certainly can be in a healthy diet. In pretty much all things, it's about moderation. I think one of the reasons it does belong is that we don't tend to have a lot of great choices for protein otherwise. And instead, taking it out has ended up with a lot more carbohydrate in our diet, which hasn't been good for our waistlines.
I do believe that meat belongs in a healthy diet. I think protein is good. I don't think you necessarily have to have meat with every single meal, but I do think that it can be part of a healthy diet.
I'm okay with meat as part of a healthy diet. I've lost like 25, 30 pounds, and I've used meat with it. I believe in, protein is important. Not having it all the time, but differences, fish, chicken, meat, rotated, and, combine that with some, pasta and greens and salads. So I'm just a more diverse eater. I don't one of those ones that has to have meat every day or has to have a certain food every day. So I kind of like, for us, to try to make it very simple. I would say three times a week we have red meat for dinner, some version of it. The other two, maybe one other fish, 2 chicken, and then 2 pizza or whatever we bring in from outside or get someplace separately.
So I think what you saw is quite a few people mentioned health, they mentioned the environment, they mentioned everything is okay in moderation. And that's what the interesting thing is when we look and combine those videos from just consumers of all walks of life, of all incomes, of all areas of the United States. And what they're bringing up is animal welfare, it's health, it's planet, and it's a little bit of a source of guilt. And what happened during the pandemic is that we actually saw an additional one popping up, and that had everything to do with what happened in the media as well, which was that idea of social responsibility. Are we taking care of the workers in our plants? Are we taking care of our farmers? So these really are the concerns that are keeping some of the people from eating meat as much as they might like to because of that level of guilt. And that level of guilt is absolutely encouraged, if you will, all throughout. If we watch TV, if we're shopping here, I took some pictures. I don't know about you, but I've always called it faux leather. Well, now it's vegan leather. Or the purse on your right, it's no longer a clear plastic purse. It is a vegan purse. You hear about award dinners with Hollywood, and they all have to be vegan. So there is this idea of vegan being hip, whereas eating meat, especially beef, has somewhat of a negative connotation right now. Here's an article from Forbes that talked about the trends being ominous and the fact that environmental activists have been pointing out the brontosaurus-sized carbon footprint of eating small amounts of beef. And it just goes on and on about how plant-based alternatives are supposedly great tasting and wildly popular. In fact, this same article predicted that we will all be defunct by 2030 because scientists are developing new types of meat and milk type products that are tastier and easier on the environment. Well, when we think about that, it results into at least some people building up the level of guilt to where they want to eat a little bit less meat and poultry. In fact, that's 34% of Americans. Most of those are flexitarians, as you can see. But still, if you look at the 28% of meat eaters that have a goal of eating a little bit less, we might continue to see continued pressure on that volume and continued growth of flexitarians. But the thing is, plant-based is not the answer that the Forbes and many other articles make it out to be. Here are the real stats. If you look at the retail environment, at the refrigerated area only, those plant-based meat alternatives only have a household penetration of 10%. Out of that 10%, 41% only bought the refrigerated plant-based alternatives once. So either that was a curiosity thing, it was a trial thing, or maybe when the entire meat case was empty throughout the pandemic, that's what they bought because that tended to be the one section that was still open. Now, credit where credit is due, they've been the growing distribution, there's more of those items, but when it comes down to it, these plant-based meat alternatives are 0.3% of sales, 0.3% of volume, 0.6% of dollars, and about 3% of packages. But what it is a lot of people look at these growth rates and they see that refrigerated plant-based alternatives were up 84% last year, whereas meat was up 19%. What they forget is how different these different bases are that the growth is based off of. And when you look at the actual dollars, you see that plant-based meat alternatives increased 217 million and meat increased 13.3 billion. So my answer and my question to these people is usually, which ones do you rather have? 19% on 83 billion or 84% on half a billion? So hopefully those stats help you a little bit. What it really results into more than plant-based meat alternatives is this idea of want versus needs. People looking for something that is better for them, better for the planet, better for the farmer or worker, or better for the animal. And that's really influencing the purchase decision a little bit more. So let's walk through all of those, because we're seeing that retailers all throughout the globe are making those connections a little bit more. On your left, you see Carrefour in France that has a whole program throughout the fresh departments that is for the farmer, for the environment, for the animal, and you. You see advertising in the store, happy chickens lay happy eggs, and a lot of focus on reducing waste, recycling, food banks, etc. So the retailers are starting to make these connections. And by all means, meat is recognized as an important nutrient by most people, just like we saw in the videos. Everything's okay in moderation. And that's most of the strategies. Avoid the second helpings, have some smaller portion sizes. So what we see, especially in Europe, is that the idea of portion size variety is helping actually sales. So we can actually sell more by selling a little bit less. As you can see here, you can literally buy one chicken breast, you can buy two, or you can still buy the family pack. So that's something to think about. When we ask shoppers what they want to see highlighted, because if you think about any box of cereal or breakfast bars or frozen food items, they have all these big package call outs, protein rises to the top. And while anybody working in the meat industry might say, well, of course, protein, meat is all protein, but that is something that a lot of consumers do not realize. In fact, I did videos before, more people thought that peanut butter is the better source of protein than they thought it was chicken breast. That was my comparison. So think about what are some of these relevant items that you can work on with retailers to highlight on the package. You see that more and more here in the US. You see calories, protein, carbs pop up. It's certainly something that plant-based items are doing quite a bit. So since they are highlighting protein, absolutely make sure that you are part of that trend as well. More and more we're seeing too is an increased focus on comparative information. What I mean by that is right here you see this chicken product that is focusing on having 45% fewer calories than beef. Here is bison, fewer calories, cholesterol, and fat than beef. Here's the blend, so many fewer calories than beef. So right now, beef is really on the focus of all the other proteins and blends. So keep that in mind, where it's very important for the beef industry to start building a positive story in this regard as well. In addition to packages, we're seeing a lot happening on the in-store signage, on all that real estate above the case. We see some great information on pork, what are all the nutrients, and we tend to see it for grass-fed beef specifically, a lot of talk about the omega-3 fatty acids. But for beef in general, I think we can do a much better job talking about all the positives in the diet, and why it is perfectly okay for people to eat beef in moderation, if we want to use their terminology. But certainly highlighting favorable nutrients, I think, is a big opportunity for the beef industry, especially if we're able to tie what I call the features with the benefits. So don't just talk about iron and protein, but like the Dole broccoli package is doing here, combine that information where it says vitamin C and vitamin A to support the immune system. Now, I know there's a lot of rules and regulations about what you can put on packages and signage, but this might be something worth looking into. The other thing relative to health, I think, is blends. Blends have a very good, healthy halo, if you will, where people feel that at least part of the portion is replaced with vegetables that have a very big health halo. And what you tend to see is that the packaging of these blended items tend to have a lot of visual for those beautiful carrots and kale and all the other items that are blended in. And it gives a little bit more permissibility to the eating of beef altogether. I think this might be an area that's really going to take off here in the next few years. The second one, influencing decisions, is planet, and we're seeing that play out quite a bit in anything from food waste to package waste to energy and water reservation. And 60% of consumers say that they're doing their part. So they're really looking for a lot of the vendors to reward their efforts as well with their own purchases. So we're seeing that play out in the meat case, especially among those focused on regenerative agriculture, where they're starting to educate the consumer about eating meat that is good for them and the planet. As you can see here, Force of Nature, which is a bison product, as well as a lot of focus on different packaging that have less plastic or no styrofoam type of thing. So keep that in mind, where sustainability is absolutely a growing area as well. Animal welfare, that is a really, really big one. Here in the US, 44% of consumers said, I don't know, or I do know that the meat and poultry that I buy comes from humanely treated animals. That's 44%. But 40% said, you know what? I don't really know. The question I ask, whose voice do you think that 40% is hearing? Is it our voice from the industry about everything that we are doing to make sure that the animals have a good life? Or is it the voice of the activist? So when we ask consumers about animal welfare, let's listen to a video here and see what they have to say. And I'll warn you, it is brutal when you're in this industry.
I have seen what factory farms look like. I know that we are, if I was one of those animals, I would be deeply unhappy. And it may impact my consumer decisions moving forward. I think if there were brands who really, I think, led with at least a concrete plan on how they plan on meeting the supply demands of the country, but also treating the animals well and being affordable. I mean, they're probably going to get my business, and I imagine they're going to get the business of a lot of Americans.
It is the cycle of life. That's why we raise them and hunt them. That's how the world goes around.
That is an area that I have not looked into that much, but obviously there's chicken farms where they're so fat that they can't get up and walk around. They're stepping over other dead chickens, and that's just horrible. And then the cow slaughterhouses. So I think, for me at least, I try and look out for the organic foods just solely for that purpose, because they're treated more humanely. So for sure, I think it's very poor in the United States, especially. I think that we do not take care of our animals, and food the way that we need to be taking care of it. And I know for sure in countries abroad, they don't even have what's called organic because they just don't treat their animals that way. They don't pump them full of chemicals and things that they're not even supposed to be eating. So I think in America, it's particularly bad. Yes.
Definitely. I think the welfare of the animal is important. Like I said, the less stress the animal has, obviously, I think the better the quality of meat's going to be. I don't know. I haven't read enough about whether or not the U.S. meat industry is good.
Animal welfare issues do not play a big role in our purchases, and they absolutely definitely should, because I find the way chicken is handled to be kind of gross, but we buy it anyway.
I believe that, especially in the meat and pork industry, probably chicken too, but I believe that the U.S. has some questionable practices as far as their farming goes. I still think we should, at all possible, buy from family farms, and so I do some of that.
What I think and how I act are two different things. I will go to the store knowing about factory farms and knowing about all of this stuff, and I will buy just whatever is on sale, and it doesn't really matter. I kind of feel like a hypocrite because I want to buy with my conscience, I guess, but I'm a realist as well, and I know that those animals wouldn't exist without meat production in mind, so I kind of treat them as if they were farm-raised vegetables, I guess.
As I said, it's a little bit ouch, but there's definitely a lot of consumer concern and some sentiment out there that animal welfare is not what it is. And I think that's where transparency really comes into play. Transparency is the currency of trust. And the more we can talk about it as the entire supply chain in meat, especially beef, the better it is, because it's something, again, where they are hearing the activist voice. You heard a lot of them talking about whether they're reading items, whether they're listening to podcasts, or all sorts of different sources of information. The more we can talk about the actual practices, I think the better. So I wanted to share some with you from really throughout the world. Here in the US, you see some chicken brands starting to focus in the store, on their website, on the pack, talking about who is the farmer and allowing people a peek into the farm and understanding where it comes from. The QR code, if you're not working with that yet, that is really back from non-existence there for a few years, allowing people to see where it comes from, recipes, etc. And I think it's very important too to use just everyday terminology. Humanely raised, what does that really mean? And so here you have Patterson Farm out of Texas, just talking about in very plain English, moral and ethical obligation for the care and the well-being of our animals. I think that's some great, good examples of how you can really visualize that for the consumer. Social responsibility is also starting to come out a little bit more in the US market. So you see things like working together with the Heart Association, giving back a donated meal for every pack purchased, or just making sure that there's fair pay for the farmers as well. In Germany, what we're seeing is that all packages have this little 4-tier half circle on the package, and it's from 1 to 4, 4 being organic, and it's a reflection of the animal welfare system. It's not mandatory, but a lot of retailers now say at the very least, we want number 1 or we want number 2. And from the consumer perspective, you can very easily see what animal welfare is reflected on what package. There's one German retailer that went a step further and has these TV screens hanging all over the store. Here you see one in the produce department, flashing from farm to farm to show the sourcing farm live in the show. So in the store, so you see these animals just roaming around and just giving people access to where and how the animal was raised. Another program interesting out of Germany is a 10-cent additional heart for producers, where for every package sold, a 10-cent is donated to the domestic producer. And especially if you're in the higher end, that's an interesting one to look at. England then, here, on pack and in-store strategies. What they're doing a lot is focusing on outdoor breeding, retailers putting themselves between the farm and the consumer and say, we do business with farms that we know and trust. But it's really gotten to the point where it is an area of differentiation. We were the best retailer in Europe for 3 times in a row. So that's how far animal welfare has gone there. In the Netherlands, another example for both chicken and pork, you see these big grids that are on the pack and on the shelf where it shows the 3 different star ratings and how many pigs per meter, if they had access to entertainment materials, days with mother, hours of transportation. So many of these systems are not about restricting choice, but they're about providing an educated choice. So that was something that moved very quickly in Europe and something to keep an eye on for the Canadian market as well. So let's talk a little bit about pandemic purchasing. What we're seeing is that 43% of consumers are still buying more meat now than they did pre-pandemic. And that's why we continue to see that 20-something% above 2019 levels. What we're seeing is the more variety people buy, the more meat they tend to buy because people get bored with things. So really important for us to focus on all the different cuts that are possible and educating people on those as well. And that's exactly what we saw in the basket. Here you can see a 15% increase in the number of different cuts per buyer in 2020. Beef did extremely well with beef steak, 25% of dollars per buyer, ground beef 21%, and also roast in that mix as well. So very, very good increases also in steak in terms of household penetration. So that's really what was behind that enormous increase in beef in 2020. Additionally, what's behind it is a very big one, and that's lunch and dinner. If we think about all the people working from home, all the students home from school, that moved a lot of consumption occasions from restaurants to the retail environment. And you see now companies like Hormel here in the US that has a lunch whisperer coming up with ideas for quick lunches because that's such a new occasion where people now starting to make that at home versus eating out. And of course, we have more people at home as well, driving all those numbers. So what we're seeing here is that a lot of retailers are starting to kind of reset their cases to not necessarily say beef, chicken, pork, but really focus on dinner, entertaining, lunch, what have you. So that's a completely new type of approach to the market. And we also see a lot of changes in the purchase planning itself. So what we saw in 2020 was a lot fewer pounds and a lot fewer dollars sold on promotion. So that means it was in the ad circular, it was just on markdown in the store, there was a special display. Of course, we didn't know what was going to be in stock from one week to the next in those early months, but we also knew people were going to buy, and that was another way also to not discount as much with all the additional costs that were in the system. The only area of the meat case that did increase in promotions, ironically, was plant-based meat alternatives that had promoted a whole lot more, whereas everything else was down. But from the consumer perspective, promotional research did grow more important. If you think about it, they were at the store less often, buying more at one time. So about 80% looked at what was on sale at their primary store. Some even looked across multiple stores. But more than anything, when people are in store, they're using that signage and they're rifling through the package to find the one item that they really want to purchase. So continue their importance, I would say, as we don't quite have seen the economy kick into gear the way we would like. In terms of the types of discounts, absolutely the dollars off or cents off per pound is by far the most important one in terms of ranks. And meat BOGOs was another one that came on really strong, of course, especially with people buying so many items at the same time. So buy one, get one free is another strategy. If you're not doing that yet, look into it with your retailers as well. In terms of channel choices, we didn't see people shop around as much, and that really benefited the traditional supermarket channel. And people were taking fewer trips to things like convenience stations or even big super centers, that type of thing. And instead, of course, we saw a ton of buying online happening. In 2019, we only had 15% of Americans who had bought meat online. Well, that jumped to 28%. That's far behind items like center store, even produce, but still there's been big growth. And now about 10% of all meat in the United States is sold online. So that gives a lot of brands and everybody in the supply chain some opportunity for direct to consumer sales as well. The interesting thing about e-commerce is that we're seeing huge brand loyalty because so many people start with their past purchases. So it's very, very important to make sure that you have high brand awareness, that beef is on the top of the list, because that really ends up being one of the biggest drivers for ending up in that online basket again. Let's talk a little bit about a variety of purchase influencers next, starting with case ready, meaning it is packed and packaged and cut in a central USDA facility versus cut and packaged in the store. We've been tracking that for many, many years. And as you can see, the favorability, so the share of shoppers who said case ready, just as good as cut in the store, has gone up and up and up. And in 2021, it was 26% who said, I actually think that might be better, and 55% who said equally good, for a total of 81%. So as we continue to deal with labor issues in the store, definitely case ready is something that is very accepted by consumers in the stores these days. In terms of brands, that's something else where we really see a big impact of millennials. A lot of the boomers will walk the meat case, kind of study a couple of different packages because they know meat and they decide, and they don't really care about the brand. But what we're seeing is among the younger shoppers that they look a lot at the different brands, and they have moved to an outright brand preferences, whether that's a store brand or a manufacturer brand. But as you can see, for both fresh and processed meat, brands matter more than they ever did before. In terms of claims, so anything from organic to antibiotic to grass-fed, that continues to be a big indicator of sales growth. That has been for years, and especially an interesting one for beef is grass-fed, still up 35%. But keep in mind too, it's a small sliver of that total meat buy at a little bit less than 1 billion. So let's have a listen here to what consumers have to say about buying claims-based meat.
I do tend to buy more chicken that is organic and antibiotic free, more so than pork or beef. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's just that I've been exposed to more information about hormones and antibiotics in poultry. I'm not sure. I think it also has something to do with the fact that we eat more chicken than we do beef or pork. So I feel like just sort of with the quantities that we're consuming, I'd rather my family consume chicken that has not been raised with the use of antibiotics and has been raised organically.
I don't tend to buy any of the meats with production claims like organic or how they were handled, primarily because there's a notable price premium to it. And a lot of times I don't think there's very legitimate actions behind it or any difference in the end result.
Really haven't looked at it that serious. I probably should be, but I'm really looking at the more of the no antibiotics, less things injected into the animal before it is processed. To me, some of the other things are very hard to establish, and I don't think they have any marginal value for me. Whether it's humanely raised or grass-fed, it's hard to be proven, I guess. The only one I would really think about was the antibiotics one, because that kind of affects as it goes into our bodies.
Regular meat, whatever's on sale.
Whatever is on sale. Okay, so what's the reason for not buying organic and grass-fed?
It costs a lot more.
Typically, we do look for grass-fed, organic types of meat products. For me, I feel like the meat itself is going to be a better quality if it's not stressed and if it's eating the right foods. If it's got either bad food or antibiotics or things in there that shouldn't be inside the animal already, then I don't think that's going to make the meat better. I think pure is best.
Well, I specifically buy meats with no antibiotics because I feel like that is a healthier animal. I feel like the antibiotics may cover up some problems with the way the animal's raised. So I would prefer to have an animal raised in a more natural way.
And like when I'm buying chicken, I try not to buy like the cheapest one that looks like, you know, giant mutant chicken breasts. I try to get the one that's in between the organic one and the mutant chicken breast. There's usually one that's normal, that is like average chicken size. And I feel like that's a better option than buying like the one that's 99 cents a pound and is kind of scary huge. So I'm not buying organic. I think it's called natural. Or it's not humanely raised, but it's the natural one. So I do that in chicken. In pork, I don't care. I just buy whatever. And in beef, I have bought grass-fed before, but it's got to be a really great price point for me because I'm not going to pay double for grass-fed beef.
You know, when I listen here to these videos, and I took most of them, what comes to mind for me is
I
there's
do tend to buy
an enormous level of confusion. But the one that tends to come out again and again is really that idea of antibiotics. And again, I think transparency is our currency of trust. And the more we can teach them about the idea of how animals are raised, the less confusion there might be out in the marketplace. So I think, there we go. The other thing that is influencing consumers quite a bit right now is that idea of cross merchandising. So what we're seeing more and more is these meal stations and virtual ways of merchandising with a cart, like make a burger in the cheese department, that type of thing. If you have good ideas, I know the retailers would love to hear it. So always be sharing ideas that you're seeing out in the marketplace back. Eye-catching merchandising, I think that is a fantastic way to go about it by being able to stop a consumer from their walk throughout the store and maybe inspiring them to a beautiful tomahawk steak here, or a restaurant type of meal in a box that they can make at home. The next best thing, as Tesco here is advertising that. All sorts of opportunity for seasons as well. If I had to predict the rest of the year, I would say that seasons are going to be continuing to sit in the retail environment more than in restaurants. And so having good solutions for various seasons, in addition to different ones, pumpkin season, all these different items that are out there, I think continues to be a strong suit for retail for the remainder of 2021. Value added has been growing very well, and it's actually steaming up a little bit right now with people just sick and tired of cooking. Value added beef is one of the biggest ones in that area, now 2.6 billion and up 19%. So that's anything from patties and even meatballs to beef kebabs and that type of thing. Has been a great demand for that as well. In terms of preparation and consumption, we see that the vast majority of meals continue to be cooked at home. People estimate that at about 81%. So as you can see, that's just holding very, very strong from the summer when the COVID cases were fairly low here in the US. And the beauty of all that cooking is that we have an increased meat IQ, as I call it. So we have many people, especially millennials, that are feeling more knowledgeable about meat. And the thing and the importance for beef in that regard is that, sure, ground beef doesn't have much of an entry barrier, but some of the roast and the ribs absolutely do. So the fact that people were forced to buy cuts that they never bought before, as well as forced to cook a whole lot more versus eating out, I think is going to benefit us for years, if not just generations to come. In terms of what is happening at the home, I would point out that we have a couple of friends here too in our new appliances in the beef industry. We know a lot of people don't like to make roast because it takes forever. Well, now we're seeing technologies like the Instant Pot completely change that, where a solid frozen roast can still be cooked in 30, 45 minutes and be on the table. So that's exactly what we're seeing, is a greater reliance on frozen items. And as a result, all these different technologies are completely changing what people are buying. So think about that too as you work through your processing and merchandising into stores as well. And that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing whole lines and whole programs being developed from the slow cooker on back for the Instant Pot, sliders for the grills. We spent billions of dollars on grills and smokers in 2020 and 2021. And also butchers here talking about what is sous vide and why do I love it. So some great ways to think about the merchandising from the appliance on back. Because one thing is for certain, people are bored with their go-to meals. Normally about 70-75% of people say, I tend to cook meals that I know how to make and tend to make. Well, that's down to 52%. And instead we're seeing people go to YouTube and Pinterest and friends and family. And what I want to say here is they love getting recipes from people in the industry themselves, whether that's the butcher in the store or whether there's the rancher on the ranch. So if when you're grilling, when you're just passionate about your own product, these are great ways for us to connect with the consumer and also just inspiring them to try a beef cut that they have never tried before. And that's exactly what's happening in a lot of the retailers here in the US with direct merchandising, like tired of the same old thing, here's our solution. Take a recipe with some spices right in the meat department. So I'm going to end it out with a little bit of crystal ball here looking forward. I think the beef industry is going to continue to see some great sales and strong sales. I think inflation is going to push the dollars, but certainly we're doing well on volume now 2 years in a row. Beef has been the top performer, but I do think we have to address altogether the idea of health and nutrition and transparency. And I think that really came out in the consumer videos that we watched throughout this presentation here today. And think about the holidays, think about economic pressure, think about everything that we've been talking about. And I'm absolutely convinced that we're going to see continued beef growth for the remainder of this year in 2022. So I hope that was useful for you. Here is my email address. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime you have questions. Find me on LinkedIn. I'm always posting about meat performances and meat insights. And I also always welcome just feedback, pictures, what have you. So it was a pleasure being here with you. Thank you. And I'm ready to answer some of your questions.